Hello, viewers, and welcome to Spotlight here on Hope TV, where you look and live. And we are always doing our very best to bring you persons who are making a huge difference in our society. And as they make their difference, they are inspired by their faith in Jesus Christ. And as we always tell you, you are part of this conversation, so do engage us on 22232. That's our text message line. Also engage us on Twitter and Facebook. We will be glad to hear what you have to say, especially about the subject today and our guest for this program. Now, have you ever thought about space, right? Just space, and of course, as a Christian, you must be interested in space, because every time we think about heaven, we look up. And our guest on Spotlight today is Dr. John Kimani. And who is Dr. John Kimani? Maybe this might give you a headache, but he's a gentleman who has a PhD in physics. Now, that is quite something. But more than that, he is the acting director of the acting director general of Kenya Space Agency. How often do you hear about that? And he is with us here on Spotlight to tell us more about Kenya and space, the present and the future. Dr. Kimani, welcome to Spotlight.
Thank you, Edwin.
And this is the handshake season, so also welcome to Hope TV. This is your very first time.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, glad to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, space and you.
Yes.
You know, and you know, I'm just beginning. First, do you believe in aliens? You know, we always think that scientists, when they think, well, especially those who are involved in space, you know, the big question we ask: are we alone in the universe? You know?
Yes, I believe there could be aliens. In fact, this is one of the bodies of physics. One of our biggest questions that we are trying to answer is, are we alone? Do we have other beings in space? And to be able to understand that, we need to look out into space. And therefore, when we talk about space, we talk about equipment, measuring instruments that are placed out there in space. And their work is to look out, looking for aliens, or looking down on Earth in what we call remote sensing.
Okay.
Yes.
You know, it's interesting, you know, when you say there could be, then a very scientific statement there. And Dr. Kimani, you are a Christian, a scientist and a Christian. And sometimes we often think that scientists, somewhere along the way, they could start with faith, but somewhere along the way, it dims, right? But you have sustained your faith even in the midst of your space ventures, right? How can you explain that?
Thank you very much. I think this is a very pertinent question. Yes, I am a practicing Anglican. I worship at All Saints Cathedral Church. For the last 6 years, I've been serving in the parochial church council. And I think that tells you a lot about my faith.
I'm sure they also have a leakage in terms of the bearing to heaven, you know, now that you are part of their leadership, you know.
So I believe in Jesus. In fact, I confess him as my Lord and Savior. Yes.
Okay. You know, it's interesting because you see scientists, and most of them don't believe in God for one reason or other. And you are in the midst of these scientists, I'm sure. People who maybe question as to why you're still hanging on to this very subjective belief, you know? How do you engage with your fellow scientists who don't subscribe or don't understand, you know, how you can hang on to a faith in God, whereas you have lots of knowledge and lots of intelligence, so to speak, and, you know, how do you interact and how do you relate?
A very good question, Edward. I think I would call it confusion that comes by way of thinking you have learned. As you progress from primary school to secondary school to university, you start doubting the beliefs that you held in nursery school, in kindergarten, in Sunday school, in primary school. And I think this is what the Bible calls developing foolishness. So you start to think that you know, and the truth of the matter is that as you think you know what we call worldly knowledge, you start becoming foolish in terms of spiritual knowledge. And I think this comes about because you tend to think that you should give 100% of your time to chasing, looking, answering questions in the realm of academics. And you do not have any time to search into the real knowledge, the knowledge of our Creator.
Okay. You know, and it must be quite something as you know, be one of those scientists who still is very committed to the faith. And on a day-to-day basis, the imagination would be this, that as a scientist, especially of space, right, that you encounter, it's bigger than you, right? Space is bigger than you, and so one would expect maybe a certain humility because space is so big. And maybe you can tell us about scientists that you know that actually also, out of their work, they actually find the faith.
I like quoting the first person to step on the moon, Armstrong. What Armstrong testified when he came from space and after having stepped on the moon, he said that when he left the Earth and was able to see the blue planet, that brought the realization of how great a creator there must be. He went up an unbeliever, he came back believing.
Amazing. You know, so it's actually possible to find God in the midst of your scientific endeavors.
Precisely.
All right. Now, can you just tell us, this could be like a really basic question, but on your assessment, when the Christians say heaven is up, right? And you deal with up on a day-to-day basis, how do you engage that? Where exactly, from a space point of view, where could heaven be?
Another very good question, Edward. I think one of the questions that scientists continue to try to grapple with is what exists beyond what we are able to see. Do we have other beings up there? Is it possible to be able to go out and experience heaven out there? So scientists are still looking at answers to such questions. But if you go back to the good book, the Bible, it talks about there being a heaven and an earth. In fact, at the end of times, there'll be a new heaven and a new earth. So these are physical places. But heaven could be a spiritual realm. So even as we talk about the heavens being up, the answer could easily be that the earth, the physical earth, is what we can touch, the blue planet. But heaven is a spiritual realm that we cannot experience physically. So however much the scientists may look out there, they may not experience heaven, because I think it is a spiritual realm.
Okay.
Yes.
Of course, that I would really want to engage that with a theologian, you know. But, you know, well put there. And let's now come to the agency, you know, the Kenya Space Agency. Many people don't know about this agency. Can you maybe tell us about what this agency does?
Thank you, Edward. The Kenya Space Agency was established last year, in the year 2018. In fact, the inauguration of the Kenya Space Agency took place on the 11th of September last year. The government has realized that there is need to have a body that promotes, that coordinates, that regulates activities that relates to information that is derived from satellites and from space equipment. So in a nutshell, therefore, the mandate of the Kenya Space Agency is to promote those activities, is to coordinate those activities, is to regulate those activities that relates with all the information, with all the data that is obtained from equipment, from objects that we have placed out there in space.
All right.
Yes.
Shortly, we would also want to hear about the future, the space strategy. But before that, maybe you can also tell us, Dr. about this is Kenya, and we're talking about space. What are some of the space applications?
Thank you very, very much. When you talk about space, people have the tendency to think about the moon. People have a tendency to think about space exploration. People have a tendency to think about rockets and all these sophisticated equipment. But what the government of Kenya has realized is that there are certain applications that affects the ordinary mwananchi that require an entity like the Kenya Space Agency to coordinate so that the ordinary farmer out there, the ordinary fisherman out there, the ordinary mwananchi out there can be able to access and obtain the benefits of what is to be offered by activities of outer space.
Okay. It's interesting that you talk about space, applying it to a place where a farmer is able to benefit, a fisherman is able to benefit. Can you just break down this for us and just give us some concrete example of how maybe a farmer, a fisherman is able to benefit from the agency's work? Thank you very much.
One of the challenges that we get as scientists is because our areas happens to be a bit abstract. But I'll attempt to break down this to the layman. Now, one of the simplest examples of applications of space activities to ordinary people is that using pictures that are taken from satellites, we are able, for example, to advise farmers using simple apps. We are able to advise farmers and tell them that for this area, the type of fertilizers that you need are such and such. We are able to do what we call space-based agricultural monitoring. And when you talk about space-based agricultural monitoring, you mean being able to monitor the growth of crops. We are able to monitor pests. Like, for example, recently we have had the problem of the fall armyworm. Using satellite information, using pictures that are taken from satellites, we are able to monitor the fall armyworm and be able to warn farmers quite in advance that the armyworms are progressing from east to west, progressing from north to south. And therefore we are able to warn the farmers well in advance, and farmers will be ready, armed with the pesticides that they would be required to spray to curb such pests.
Okay.
Another application, of course, is using space pictures. Again, we are able to advise fishermen and tell them that the areas where we are likely to find a lot of fish is this. And we use what we call vegetation index. Using satellite pictures, we are able to tell that in the sea, this is where fish are likely to be, because they are likely to be feeding, or they are likely to be moving so that they go and reproduce. So using such data, we are able to advise farmers where they can do their fishing.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, Dr. Harry, how do you disseminate that information to the farmer? How does it get there? I know you mentioned apps, and but when you think about fishermen and apps and farmers and apps, sometimes it's a bit, there's a distance between the farmer and the app. So how do you get this information to them? And sometimes, do they act on this information when it gets to them?
A very good question. Again, I think this is an area where the Kenya Space Agency will find a lot of work, and it will do a lot of engaging with the youth. Already we have applications that use the simple gadgets, the simple telephone set, and youngsters in universities have been able to develop applications where they can use information that is obtained from satellites, and it can be taken directly to users in the villages, and using those applications, the farmer in the village somewhere in the Rift Valley will be able to say, yes, this type of soil we have here is deficient of these minerals, and therefore these are type of fertilizers that we can apply.
And again, staying on that, because that's a real benefit. What is the rate of take-up in terms of this kind of information? Are you finding farmers or users, increasingly seeking this kind of space-generated information, or are we still far out?
I want to thank a certain body that is based in Nairobi, courtesy of about 25 countries, African countries. That is the Regional Center for Mapping of Resources for Development. It is based in Kasarani, in Nairobi. And for the last 20 to 25 years, they have been working with students in universities to develop such applications. And they are limited in the amount of people, amount of farmers, the number of farmers they can reach, because, like I said, it is an institution that is owned by about 25 African countries. But now that we have established the Kenya Space Agency, now this is going to be one of our duties. Our core duty will be to make sure that more and more farmers are able to access this information. And therefore we are going to work with the youth, we are going to work with young people in colleges and in universities to be able to develop more and more applications that use the information that is derived from our satellites for use by farmers in our villages. So this is, so it is happening, but the uptake is rather low, but our work is already well cut out.
Okay, clearly, and of course when the uptake is low and you're 1 year old, it means also making an impression is easy, because it's in a way a very raw area. Looking forward to seeing a farmer, like before they decide what they want to do, either they can go to a local agency, that has been established by you to get particular information, or there could be people who come to enlighten farmers and fishermen or those kinds of users on patterns that they need to consider, and we look forward to that. And you've mentioned university students quite a bit. And when we hear space agency, one of the questions we ask ourselves as a country, what's our capacity? As much as we want to think about farmers in the Rift Valley and think about fishermen in the lake, when you mention space agency, we can't help but think NASA. We can't help but think, the European Space Agency. You can't help but think that. So what's our capacity as far as that, the space utilization is concerned?
Thank you very much, Edward. This is another very, very good question. I would like to start by saying that we are not starting from zero. We have had government departments that have been doing what we have been created to do. One of the departments that have been doing what we are being created to do, all the way from when we acquired independence, is what we call the Department of Resource Surveys and Remote Sensing, DRSRS. They have been domiciled in the Ministry of Environment, and we have trained very many Kenyans in use of information that is obtained from satellites. Another department that has trained a lot of people in space activities is the Kenya Meteorological Services, what used to be the Kenya Meteorological Department. Those ones have been using meteorological satellites, courtesy again of the European Space Agency, and we have very many people who have been trained, both serving and people who are in the private sector who have been trained by the Kenya Meteorological Services. So do we have capacity in Kenya? Yes, we do have. Recently, we have had a number of universities establishing departments that are focusing on space science and space science applications. I would like to say that most departments of geography in all or most of our universities have for a long time been teaching remote sensing. Most of our survey departments in most of our universities, especially in the University of Nairobi, go to Technical University of Kenya. These departments have been training remote sensing and geodetic engineers, surveyors who use satellite information to be able to map our country. So we may not have the critical mass of the number of scientists that we require in this area. Certainly, a lot of work needs to be done. We need to work very, very closely with our universities and other tertiary institutions. But I would like to say that we are not starting from zero. We have quite a good number of Kenyans who are trained in these areas.
Okay.
Yes.
No, it's one of the areas in the course of our interactions with life. It seems the space area is an area where the universities are critical. You know, oftentimes you'll not hear somebody cite the universities as often as you have cited them. It means that these institutions of higher learning, they go hand in hand with your work. It's as if your work, in a way, depends on them. Now, can you shed light on that?
That is correct. By the nature of space applications, you need people who are trained in taking the pictures using cameras that are placed in satellites that are in space. That is technical. So you need people who are specialists, who are specially trained in this area.
When you hear about our universities and the quality of output that they release to the country, it's been under question for quite some time now. That we have lots of universities and lots of programs, but in terms of the quality, it's not where it should be for various reasons. I know here is your department, which is the Kenya Space Agency, which is very dependent on the university itself, either in terms of capacity, also maybe in terms of research, right? Now, when you find the university, the local universities especially, being in a good place to take you where the agency wants to go?
Thank you very much. I think I'm very, very happy that we're in the process of starting a new curriculum in our education. You are right. I think the curricula we have had over the years has not addressed the problem of training people who are hands-on. Mm-hmm. But I believe that the new curriculum, and I think this has come out very, very clearly during the statements that have been made by the new Minister for Education, mm-hmm. Professor Magoha. Kenya is now turning a new leaf where we will focus on producing graduates who can deliver, who have got hands-on mm-hmm. experience. And that is what the Kenya Space Agency will be relying on. Mm-hmm. Do we have lecturers who can teach? Yes, we do have. I think our only challenge may be in specialized equipment. Mm-hmm. And I think Kenya is capable of obtaining what is required to be able to train our engineers, our technicians, so that we will have the critical mass mm-hmm. of people who can be used in this field. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Now, staying with that, is there an institution of learning in this region mm-hmm. that you can say is really advanced when it comes to matters space?
In Kenya, we do not have an institution that only focuses on applications of space science. Mm-hmm. I would like to say that even in the entire continent, mm-hmm. We may not have a single institution that just focuses on applications of space science. The only institution that as a continent we can cite is in Nigeria. And what the United Nations did, in every continent, they created an institution that teaches space science education. Mm-hmm. And for the English-speaking countries, this institution is in Nigeria, in the University of Ile-Ife.
Okay, interesting.
Yes. And we keep sending very many of our students. Every year, we are sending about 5 students to be trained in that institution.
Well, it's good to know. It's good information. Just before we take a short break, and you've talked about mapping, right? I must ask you this question because one of the difficulties we are facing in the country right now is drought. And everyone is asking, I mean, why wasn't this discovered before? And you're talking about having space views, about what's going on in these areas in the country. I mean, how does the agency come in when it comes to informing in advance the state and its machinery on such kinds of calamities, so to speak?
Again, thank you very, very much. Now, what the Kenya Space Agency will do in this regard will be to work very, very closely with institutions that are already doing this work. And like I cited before, we have the Kenya Meteorological Services. Mm-hmm. We will work very, very closely with the Kenya Meteorological Services. They already have very well-trained personnel. They already have very, very good equipment. But I think what we'll be doing to assist the Kenya Meteorological Services is to be able to get other partners who we can work with and enter into memoranda of understanding so that we can use more of their data to be able to predict weather scenarios in this country, maybe in a slightly more accurate way than has happened in the past.
As you're talking about predicting, Joseph in Egypt had to dream, right? For him to predict, season, for him to know about seasons of drought and seasons of plenty. Mm-hmm. But the space agency, have being what it is, you know, and what it's supposed to deliver, then we may not need Joseph to dream anymore, because you can be able to predict for us. Now, viewers, we are talking to Dr. Kimani, who is the Acting Director General of the Kenya Space Agency. And when we come back, we must ask ourselves, I mean, when is Kenya going to launch its first rocket into space? And also we must ask ourselves, you know, when's Kenya going to set up a space station? Because that's where we must go. Stay with us. This is Spotlight.